Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Cindy Rivera, the School Counseling Department Chair. So welcome, everybody. Today we're going to start sort of the process a little bit with you all. Sophomore year is really not a time for gearing up for the whole college planning process, but we certainly want it to be a time for you to start to understand all the steps that are coming your way in the next couple of years. And it does ratchet up in junior and senior year, and one of our ways to try to keep people calm is to try to get everyone organized ahead of time. So this is why we do this for sophomores and sophomore parents. And we do have a couple of more programs coming up. So before I introduce this program, I wanted to make sure I told you about a couple of other things coming up. We actually have 3 more events, and I haven't even told all my counselors this because one just happened yesterday. We do have, on April 1st, British universities are going to come in and talk about what it means if you have any interest in applying to British universities, what that process will look like. And that'll be an evening program, and I'll send information out about that. It's something that more and more of our students are looking at, so we just thought we ought to do some information around that. And then on April 11th, we have another evening program, a college admissions evening with Anne Fleming-Brown from Union, who will talk about what's important in the application process. And then in May, we will talk to you all again at a sophomore breakfast about the whole timeline of junior and senior year around what to be getting ready for. So this is just all informational so far. So you have all of this in your storage of knowledge. So today we have Charlie O'Hearn, the CEO of Summit Educational Group, which is a test prep company that's been around for 30 years. And he's going to really talk about all the things to think about in terms of the SAT, the ACT, subject tests, PSAT, all that testing stuff that we used to do in, one paragraph in a program, and now decided there's so much to know. You need to know how to develop an effective testing plan. Charlie, we like to have, because he's actually a New Canaan High School graduate, which, yay, we like that. He's also a Yale graduate. He's an expert in the field of tutoring and test prep. He's written a number of test preparation books, and he's a frequent speaker and panelist at educational forums around the country. So we're glad to have you here today. Charlie?
Thank you, Cindy. I appreciate that. It is always fun to be here, just having walked these halls a long time ago. I graduated in 1984. Let's see. I want to also thank you guys for being here. I know it's not, well, one, it's not easy to park out there, but two, I know it's not the easiest thing to motivate to get to these. So hopefully everyone has some coffee or has had some coffee. So you each should have a packet just to tell you what you have. The big booklet is a college admissions testing guide that we put out every year. It's definitely not, a page turner. But as you go through this process, I would recommend that you could just kind of keep it on the shelf. It's a great resource. So there's that, and then you have a copy of the PowerPoint. So if you want to take notes, my goal is to end at 9, and then we'll have time for a few questions. So if you want to take notes, jot down questions. And then lastly, our office in town is the backside of Walter Stewart's. Every weekend we offer opportunities to take free practice SAT and ACTs, and the third piece of paper in there is the schedule. I think it goes through the beginning of March. So we run every Saturday and Sunday they're running. So I just want to make you aware of that. I want to try to accomplish, I guess, 3 main things. One is to contextualize the SAT and ACT. So some of you, plus or minus 10 years, look like you're roughly my age. And times have changed, right? So I want to talk a little bit about that. 2, get you thinking about creating a testing plan, a sane and sensible testing plan. And then lastly, sort of this whole ACT versus SAT thing. And that, of all the questions we get, that's probably the most common. You know, how do I figure out which one's best for me? Do I take both? How many times, et cetera? So those are the three things I want to try to get to this morning. And so times have definitely changed. I have a little illustration of that here. So how many folks here took the SAT? How many took the SAT before 1995? Okay, that should be most. So in 1995, right, the average verbal score was around a 430, and the average math score was around a 470. And so what the College Board decided to do is recenter scores. So they took those average scores, the 430 verbal and 470 math, and moved them to 500, 500. So that was sort of an inflationary adjustment to the scale. And then many of you probably know the SAT changed a couple years ago, and with that change, there was another sort of inflationary bump to the scale. So I thought it would be interesting to see what your score might be now, and I think you'll be surprised. Maybe not your exact score, you may not remember, but you'll get the general idea. So if you took the SAT before 1995 and got a 900, your score today would be a 1090, so nearly 200 points higher. 1,000 would be an 1170. 1280 would be 1,400. If you're like me, you remember that 1,400 kind of being that was the gold standard, right? That was very, very few people got 1,400s. And then 1,490 or higher back then would be a 1,600, right? So one, I do this just sort of facetiously, maybe morale booster for all of you. But two, more importantly, just to contextualize SAT scores, right? That 1,400, for instance, still a great score, but just like the dollar, it doesn't quite buy you what it did back in the day. And I think that's super important to keep in mind. And I think analogously, you know, on the college side, and you hear this all the time, I hear it all the time, I think it's true of me, frankly, I don't think I would get into my alma mater today, right? So it's just a different landscape, and I think it's important to keep that in mind. And then, so we have the SAT, and now we have another test, the ACT. So just show of hands, did any parents here take the ACT? We have a few, okay, all right. So, you know, when I was in the high school, I never heard about the ACT. I didn't know of it. It's existed since like 1956. It was a Midwestern test for the most part, and there were colleges that accepted it and colleges that didn't. And nowadays, it's been like over the last 10 years, there's been a trend, and now it sort of permeates the entire country. And you know, generally speaking, have the same number of people taking the SAT and ACT. It's like 2 million students take each of these tests. So the important point to understand is that all colleges accept both SAT and ACT, and they look at them equally. All right, they don't say one's inferior to the other. So there's no advantage to sending an SAT and not an ACT or vice versa. So that's important to keep in mind. So where do these tests sort of fit in the, you know, on the admissions side? And I would say this is something that probably hasn't changed much since we were in high school. What's common about the top? So this is, let me put this in context. So NACAC is the National Association for College Admissions Counseling. They do a survey every year, and one of the surveys they do is they survey admissions offices around the country asking about admissions factors and how important they are to them in their admissions process. These are the top 8 in that book that you have. On page 2, I think, they list all the factors and how they rate. And this is rating them, percentage of colleges reporting considerable or moderate importance. And what is common about the top 3? They all have to do with what your students are doing here in school, right? It's all sort of grades-based, rigor of curriculum, that kind of thing. And that's the point there is that is the number one most important thing from a college admissions perspective. Not too far behind that, as you can tell from this graph, are test scores. All right, so test scores are important, but as the counseling office here can tell you way more intelligently than I can, colleges today, more so than back in the day, use what's called a holistic admissions process, which means sort of not this sort of single focus on test scores or grades, but they're looking at the whole student and all the factors together. And used properly, test scores are part of that process, and they're used to complement the use of GPA and all the other factors in the process. But not all schools require test scores. So there's this test optional movement, which is growing and accelerating. In fact, UChicago, one of the most selective, previously quantitative schools in the country, went test optional this past year. I think Creighton, literally just today or a few days ago, went test optional. So this is a growing trend. This is a list of like 50, sort of probably the top 50 or so selective test optional schools. In reality, 40% of colleges are test optional, but when you sort of take away open enrollment, religious training, vocational training, and all those schools, you're left with this sort of group of what I would say are selective test optional schools. And test optional doesn't mean we don't want your scores. It means you as a student have the choice. Do I want to send them or do I not want to send them? Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about test optional. If you guys have questions at the end, we can talk about that. You know, one of the questions we get from students and parents sometimes is, so grades are the most important thing, right? What I do in school is the most important thing. Why do colleges need test scores? Like, how do they help colleges? Why are they important to colleges? There must be some reason, and I'm guessing some of you already have a sense for that. The main reason is that grades for colleges are sort of imperfect and imprecise as a tool, right? One reason is that grades vary, right, even within the high school, from teacher to teacher or from school to school, state to state, country to country. Schools have different grading scales, right? Some have 1.0 to 4.0, some have 10-point scales. So that is hard. I mean, I think you guys can all rest assured that colleges know New Canaan very well. So that's a problem for admissions people. And then the other problem is grade inflation, quite frankly. And nationally, 90% of grades given out now are A's and B's. So you can imagine being an admissions officer, and you really kind of have this compressed grade scale, right? It's like, I got all these A's and B's. How do I distinguish among students? So that's where these tests come in. So there's a common baseline, right? So on the SAT, 200 to 800, on the ACT, 1 to 36. So that's like having every school having, you know, 1 to 4 grade point scale. And then there's a consistent curve, right? So schools know, colleges know year over year, if you get a 570 on the math SAT, they know basically what that means. They know where that fits you relative to other students, at least with respect to this test. And that's the value of these tests to colleges. And again, used properly, the test scores are not used on a standalone basis, right? They're used to complement all of the other factors. So if you're like me, when I was in the high school, I did no prep. I actually didn't know, until later, I didn't know that people did prep. As soon as I told people what I did for a living, people were like, oh yeah, I did some prep. There was a class that I would tell my parents I was going to, and then I would go hang out with my friends. So test prep was not a big thing. Certainly there was no talk of having a testing plan, as Cindy referenced like, I mean, I knew there was an SAT just because I had an older brother and older sister, and I knew it was important for college, but it's like, okay, next month you've got this SAT test. And it wasn't like there was definitely anxiety, but it was just shorter lived. So now you have two tests. You have an SAT and ACT. You have a really high percentage of applications being submitted early, which extends the process. And quite frankly, college admissions is just more competitive than it was. It wasn't like it wasn't competitive, but it's more now. So more complicated, more complex. So I do think it's important to have a plan, and that's really the beauty of a session like this. And the idea is not to leave here and say, oh, I've got to have the plan and I need to start implementing the plan. That's definitely not the case. This is early in the process for this. It's more just to get you thinking about what a testing plan means and how to create a testing plan without killing yourselves, right? Without going crazy. So a testing plan is pretty simple, right? It's which test should I take? The biggest decision there is going to be SAT or ACT. When do I take them? And as you'll see, the College Board and ACT offer many opportunities throughout the year to take these tests. And then how and when do I prepare for these tests? And so those are the three elements of a testing plan. It's not super complicated. There is not one single right way to do this. There's not one single right plan, but there is a best plan for your situation. And so we'll talk about some of that stuff as we move forward. When we talk about college admissions tests, these are the tests we're talking about. So the PSAT, so your students next October will take the PSAT. That is the least important. In fact, it's not important from a college admissions standpoint, right? The P, I like to say, stands for practice. It's really a practice SAT. The SAT and ACT are the most important of these tests from a college admissions standpoint. Subject tests, you guys might remember achievement tests. That's what they were called back when I was in high school. Then they became SAT 2s. Now they're called subject tests. Those are declining in terms of schools that want them. I'll talk a little bit about that later. And then AP tests are sort of out of the scope of this talk. The pre-ACT is the ACT's version of the PSAT. Very, very few schools offer that. New Canaan does not. I don't blame them, but that's what that test is. Okay, so now we're going to get to SAT versus ACT. And of all the questions we get, this is the most common. Like, how do I figure out which one I should do? Should I do both? So I want to talk a little bit about the differences, and before we get to the specific tests, I'm going to talk a little bit about just dimensions of standardized testing or characteristics. So that vertical axis is aptitude versus curriculum-based. So when you all took the SAT, it very much leaned toward being an aptitude test. You might remember like analogies or quantitative comparisons. It felt like they were out to trick you every step of the way. That's an aptitude test. Since that time, the SAT has changed a number of times, and it's moved more and more toward being a curriculum-based test. And now it's decidedly a curriculum-based test, meaning it aligns better with what your students are doing in class, in school. It's just going to seem more accessible to them. When they look at questions, they're going to be like, oh yeah, I've seen that before. Doesn't mean it's going to be easy, but it's going to feel more familiar to them. So both of these tests now are curriculum-based tests. Where they differ is on that horizontal axis. So speed and power are psychometric terms. Speed is what you might think. It's like pacing. It's how fast is the test. Power is difficulty. All right, so speededness is, and we've all been there, it's the degree to which time is a factor, right? So the proctor's like 10 minutes to go, your heart's racing, 5 minutes to go, your palms are sweating, 1 minute to go, you're like, holy crap, I've got 5 questions left, and then pencils down. That's speededness. That's built into these tests. That's a normal part of these tests, and it's important that students know that. Power, on the other hand, is really the difficulty of the individual questions regardless of time. All right, so I was a math major. My tests in college were really pure power tests. It was like, prove this, and then I had 2 or 3 hours to do it. If I really knew what I was doing, which most of the time I didn't, I'd get it done in 15 minutes. It wasn't a matter of time, you know, but for me, like I'd use the whole time, I'd kind of wind around and maybe get somewhere, maybe not. That's a power test. So both of these tests have degrees of both, power and speed. This is the biggest difference between these two tests, though. The ACT has higher degrees of speed. It's a faster test, and the SAT has higher degrees of power. It's a more difficult test, but they're both timed. If you give me 10 kids, they take the ACT and they take the SAT, a lot of them, more than half, are going to say, I preferred the ACT, I just wish I had more time. But that's, at the end of the day, that's where a lot of the difficulty on the ACT stems from. And the SAT, again, it's more power. Okay, then we're going to come down. That was like the high-level view. Now we'll look at these tests. So just sort of big picture, similarities and differences. They're the same in that they're both really long tests. I always compare it to running a marathon, because students aren't used to taking 3.5, 4-hour tests. And this is always where I chime in and say, one of the best things you can do from a prep standpoint is to take full-length, proctored, timed practice tests. You would never go run a marathon without building up to it and training for it. Same idea. The content is generally the same. The math, arithmetic through basic trig, reading comprehension, and then writing and language. And they both have science, although they do it in different ways. They also both have essays at the end. I'll talk a little bit about those in a bit. And the essays are scored separately. High-level differences. On the math side, if you look at the math sections up here, so SAT has 2 math sections. That calc is not calculus, that's calculator. There's a no calculator math section. So that's disorienting for kids because kids are used to having that calculator, that crutch, you're taking it away. The ACT math, you get to use a calculator the whole way. So that's a difference. The science. ACT has a dedicated science section. SAT has science. They kind of shoehorned it in there in this latest change. So they have 21 what they call science questions spread throughout the math, the writing and language, and the reading. So it's a little, and you do get a science score, but it's below the level of your math and I'll call it verbal for now, math and verbal score, right? That's your math and verbal score are what colleges care about. They don't care about your science subscore. But that's a difference. So ACT has this dedicated science section, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. One of the things another similarity that I didn't talk about is rights-only scoring. So you might remember if you get a question, when we were taking it, if you got a question wrong on the SAT, you get a penalty. That's no longer the case. So it's called rights-only scoring because only your right answers are scored, right? So what does that mean for students? It means you never want to leave a question blank, right? Because if you've got 4 answer choices, even if you can't eliminate anything, you have a 1 in 4 shot at getting it right. So we always tell our kids basically, you know, with 30 seconds left in a section, just fill in what you have left blank. Scoring, you guys are familiar with SAT. So these 2 math sections come together and you get a 200 to 800 math score. And then your reading and your writing and language section come together to give you, I like to call it verbal. Technically, it's called evidence-based reading and writing. All right, so that's just kind of old school SAT scoring that you all are used to. ACT has a completely different scale, 1 to 36. Each of these 4 sections here, the English, the math, the reading, the science, are scored individually 1 to 36, and then they're averaged, and that gives you your composite ACT score. So your composite is also going to be on this 1 to 36 scale.
Are those equally weighted?
Yes, yep. That's actually a good point. I don't want to digress too much just because I'm up against the time, but one thing you might notice is that the math on the SAT accounts for 50% of your score. The math on the ACT accounts for a quarter of your score. So that's something you can think about as you're sort of making this SAT, ACT decision. All right, now we're going to just touch on each section just a little bit. Let me go back real quick. So this English, each section sort of has, except for science, has a corresponding section. So this English on the ACT corresponds to this writing and language. They're really tests of writing is what they're meant to be. So why do we have these sections? We have these sections to make sure that students still know how to write using proper sentences and punctuation and not abbreviating everything. So real quick, I finally think, like, as I'm over 50, I've started to pick some of the abbreviations up. But I'm just going to, so I'll show you an example of what this looks like. Really what this is editing and revising a draft through multiple choice. So they'll give you a passage, and it'll be much longer than this. This is like just a couple sentences, so it'll be much longer. And imagine it's an essay, and then parts of that essay are underlined, and then they're going to ask you to correct the underlined portions. So really, what are they testing? They're testing grammar, right? Things like subject-verb agreement or proper verb tense, parallelism, misplaced modifiers, all that kind of stuff. They're testing punctuation, commas, semicolons, colons, sentence structure, sentence organization, all of that. They're writing tests. These 2 sections are the most similar of the sections on the test. The difference, as you'll see with all of these sections, is the ACT's faster. So you have about 1/3 more time per question on the SAT than you do on the ACT. Reading. So they're both called the same, and they're both all reading comprehension. So you guys would remember, if you took the SAT, all those vocabulary type questions, right? Antonyms, analogies, sentence completions, those are no longer, right? So vocabulary on these tests is majorly de-emphasized. It still exists a little bit in the reading comprehension, but not nearly to the extent that it used to. So it's all reading comprehension. In fact, the SAT reading section is 65 minutes, so an hour and 5 minutes. So you can imagine having to read passage after passage for that length of time. It's tiring. The difference is SAT reading. Remember, SAT has higher degrees of power. It's going to be a little bit more difficult. The SAT reading requires a deeper kind of reading, more inference-based. Everything's a little bit more nuanced. And I'll just show you examples. So imagine you have your reading passage, and then you have these 2 questions. I've obviously left out the multiple choice. Right, that first question, what can reasonably be inferred about gliding animals from the passage? So inference, okay, immediately it's like another level of difficulty, read behind the lines kind of thing. But they don't let well enough alone. The following question, which choice provides the best evidence for the answer to the previous question? So you then have to point to which line numbers are evidence for the answer that you picked in the prior question. So that's a deep reading, right? That's not simple. The ACT is a different kind of reading. It's much faster, and for the most part, what you're trying to do is go in and grab detail, right? You're just finding things, but you have to do it quickly, right? So an example of the question here, the passage points to which of the following is a characteristic of blah, 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 blah. But it just points to, right? So go find that information, but you just have to do it quickly. I think you have, on average, it's like 13 minutes per passage for the SAT. You have under 9 minutes per passage for the ACT. So again, it's that speed versus power difference. The math. So I talked about one of the differences, which is math on the SAT has 2 sections, one of which does not allow a calculator. Another big difference is that the SAT focuses, what they focus on is more narrow than the ACT. So on the SAT, like 60% of the math is algebra. Algebra 1 and Algebra 2. And what they test at a deep level. Like you really need to know sort of the whys and wherefores of math to do well on the math SAT. It's more important, right? Whereas the ACT tests a broader array of topics, but at a much shallower level. And I'll try to show you what I mean. So I'd like to bore everybody by reading this. This is an SAT question. Just think about, like, if you're a student listening or reading this, it's very abstract, right? The graph of a linear function, f, so you have some terminology, has intercepts at a0 and 0b, so you have variables in the xy plane if a plus b equals 0 and a doesn't equal b. Which of the following is true about the slope of the graph of f, right? So particularly for parents, that's overwhelming, but even for students, it's like, how do I cut through that? Well, that's what the SAT is about. It's not a super difficult question for students who are in algebra, but it's challenging. It takes some digging. It's going to take more time, right? So here's a slope question on the ACT, and I'm not expecting you to. I'm not saying this is easy, but for students who are in algebra, this is a pretty easy question. And I was at Wilton High School last night, and there were some students in the audience, and I said, are there any brave students who can answer this question? And within 2 seconds, a girl raised her hand, and she got it right. So if 2 lines in the standard coordinate plane are perpendicular and the slope of one of the lines is 3, what is the slope of the other line? Right? So for students, they just know, okay, if I have a line and I know the slope, the perpendicular line has a slope that's the negative reciprocal, I know I'm using terminology, of that line. And it's just like that. So it's just a fact. They either know it or they don't. And so those 2 questions both have to do with the topic of slope, but kind of illustrate the differences. Science, all right, so ACT has a dedicated science section. We'll talk really quickly about it. It's a very fast section. It's a very intimidating section because you have a lot of this kind of thing. And this is not like you guys just as parents thinking that's intimidating. Students would think that's intimidating as well. You don't have to recall all of your biology, chemistry, physics, earth science. It's all there in front of you, right? So I can't remember any science, but I can do very well on this test, all right? It's mostly about navigating mazes of information like this and finding what you need to find, right? And you have to kind of keep your wits about you. So like, here's an example. So this, they call them science passages. So you have this graph, you might have a data table, you might then also have text. So it's a lot to take in. And then you have your questions. So I've just included figure 1 here. So the way you approach this is according to figure 1, so you find the figure, right? So you're using the question to kind of guide you. The temperature, okay, where's temperature? Oh, here's temperature. Of the outer core. I don't need to know what the outer core is, really. I don't really need to fully understand it, but it's here, right? Is approximately between what and what. So mentally, what you're doing is just kind of stripping away the information that you don't need. And really, this is I'm not saying it seems simple right now, but if you were to actually take a look at this, it's a pretty simple question, but it's super intimidating. And that's what the ACT science is all about. There's definitely an approach to it. So then you have run 20 miles or 22 miles of your marathon, and they tell you have to write an essay. And this is what you look like when you learn that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the essay, mainly because it's the least important part of this test. It gets scored separately, and it's the least important part of the test from a college admissions standpoint. I'd almost go so far as to say it's not important, but I hesitate to do that because I know they do get used on the margins in the admissions process. So I encourage people, when you sign up, it's optional. I encourage people to sign up, and I, of course, encourage people to do their best. They're challenging they're both challenging assignments, right? For instance, the SAT essay, you're presented with an argumentative essay, and then you have to read it, and then you have to do rhetorical analysis on it. You have to write, how well do you think the author has made his or her argument? It's really AP level kind of writing. The ACT assignment's a little bit different, but I won't get into the details there. Happy to answer questions at the end. So high level, here are the differences. SAT questions, more challenging, require deeper understanding generally, sort of narrower focus of skills, but you have more time per question. ACT, more straightforward, requires instant recognition, testing a broader scope of skills at a shallower level, but really requires a constant, rapid pace. So then the question is, well, how do I make this choice, right? So the very best way to, I wish it were that simple, it's not. A couple of things here. Let me start here. The best way to make the decision is to do it quantitatively. Look at data, right? So if you could take practice SAT, practice ACT, or use a PSAT score and then take a practice ACT and compare. And what you do, then you use what's called a concordance table, which is how admissions offices compare ACT scores to SAT scores. There's this official concordance table. This is just a small piece of it, which provides for an ACT score, an SAT score, and vice versa. So it allows you to compare. So quantitative is the best way to do it. There's some qualitative things to think about. So I talked about the math thing earlier, right? SAT math counts for half of the test. If you're allergic to science, it might be a plus in the SAT column because the ACT has that dedicated science section. The speed thing is a big thing, right? Like nobody likes that time pressure, but there are degrees of how much we dislike that time pressure. And it can create real anxiety for a lot of students. So that's something to think about as well. And if I just back up a second, I want to say a couple of things. This is not a life or death decision, right? Absolutely not. I think from sort of a sane and sensible standpoint, if at the end of this year, before you head into junior year, you can make this decision, it means, okay, I can focus on that one thing and not two things. So that's sort of a general recommendation. But if you pick one, it doesn't mean you're stuck with that forever, right? You may go down the SAT path, for example, and then get down the road at some point junior year or even senior year and say, you know what, I think I'm going to give the ACT a try because for whatever reason, I've maxed out the SAT. It's all fair game. So it's not like you're making this decision that you can never turn back and change. The other thing to keep in mind is if you give me 10 students, take both, 7 or 8 of those students are going to score the same anyway. And that's telling me that the tests are basically doing what they're supposed to do. 2 or 3 out of those 10 will have a decided advantage one way or the other, meaning it might make a difference sort of from a college perspective, and also that it's statistically significant. Okay. Subject tests really quickly. So subject tests, this it used to be back in the day, this was a big list, right? The list of schools that required achievement tests or SAT-2s. It's literally 3 colleges now that require subject tests for all students, okay? There's another group of colleges, about 13 or so, that recommend subject tests for applicants. And of course, that creates a lot of consternation because what does recommend mean? And then there's another group of about 13 colleges that require or recommend for some applicants. And those are schools typically like engineering programs at schools where they might want the math or they might want a science subject test or something like that. So subject tests can be confusing and frustrating, like what does recommend mean, right? I'd rather not send them in if I don't have to, but you're recommending them, so probably should. This is where the guidance office here and your guidance counselor can be a huge help. And I would say subject tests require a little bit of thinking and planning. So those are subject tests. These are the tests, these are the actual subjects in which you can take subject tests: math, sciences, history, literature, and then languages. They're hour-long tests, so they're not the marathons that the SAT and ACT are. They're definitely curriculum-based. The best time to do them would be at the end of your last class in that particular subject, right? So if you were doing AP US history junior year and you were planning on doing a subject test, you might do that US history subject test in May or June of your junior year. And there are instances where students probably should take subject tests at the end of sophomore year. And that's why I say it does require a little bit of advanced planning and thinking about. When should I take them? Okay, so this is a timeline. Sophomore year, May, through senior year. And you can see if you're so inclined, you could take a test every single month. You'd be deprived in January. That is a horrible, horrible idea to do that. So I am going to, well, let me point out first before I get into that, it's below here, Connecticut school day test. So this is the anticipated date for next year, for 2020, March 25, and that's a required SAT date for juniors. But let's put that aside for now. So I've got a case study here. All right, so Caden. So this would be a sample way to kind of go about this. So Caden does DIAG, stands for diagnostic tests in our parlance, takes an essay, practice SAT, practice ACT, figures out which test is better for her. She comes out with SAT. And the other thing I should say, if kids score the same, I always like to go back to the student. Which one did you prefer, right? Which one felt better to you? And that's a good gauge, because even if you score the same and one feels better, that's a big plus just mentally going in. Anyway, so she picks SAT, right? So the schedule really junior year is this: October, she takes the PSAT, March, takes a first SAT, May, takes a second SAT. This particular student, we wanted to get all these tests in here so you can kind of visualize it, but if she's doing APs, that's in May. Subject tests might be in June. And then she, in August, before senior year, decides to take an SAT a third time. So my general recommendation is for juniors to think about, again, pick that test and then between December and June of junior year, you take that test probably 2 times. And then fall of senior year, which includes summer in my mind, August, that's kind of on an as-needed basis. So if you want to take it a 3rd time, or you want to try the ACT or something like that, you might consider that. But there's also the chance that you've kind of knocked it out by the end of junior year. So that's what I would consider to be sane and sensible. What's insane and not sensible is starting testing like now, right? It's too early. So you'll hear like test early and often because it can't hurt you. I actually disagree. I think it can hurt you. And the biggest argument against it are statistics for one. So students score their best at the end of junior year and fall of senior year. And that should totally stand to reason, right? They are curriculum-based tests. So just month after month of being at New Canaan High School, working through this rigorous curriculum, they're getting better at these tests, even though it's not like direct preparation for the tests. So the vast majority of fall juniors or sophomores are just not ready to take these tests. And if you say, I want to go take an official test, you're running the risk of deflating confidence, for one, right? And you're just starting earlier than you need to start because you're not going to score your best at that time, right? So I've seen it too often where parents and families we just want to get it all done. That's not the best way to look at it because you may start early. Let's say I'm going to take my first SAT in October of junior year. Okay, well, that's not going to be your highest score for the most part. So you're going to test again in March, maybe. And then let's say you score as high as like you're one of these, high flyers and you get like a 750. You know what? I think I can do better. So then you test again. You end up finishing at the same time. So starting early doesn't really gain you much. There are other reasons, including like just lack of where are you putting your time and energy, right? Like grades and your schoolwork are the most important thing. So sane and sensible, I think, is super important. There are a few exceptions. So I think for like fall testing as a junior, if you are a super high scoring kid, like 730 or higher at that time, and you want to take it then, go for it. You're ready to do it. If you happen to be able to knock it out before you get to the craziness of junior spring, that's fantastic. Recruited athletes, sometimes coaches want scores early. Lacrosse is a prime example. So that's another place where maybe you're testing early, and then lastly, if you're doing like a junior semester abroad, you might test early. All right, 2 terms to define quickly. Score choice. Do people know what score choice is? Anyone? Score choice and super scoring. Okay, these are terms you're going to hear. And sometimes I feel like I open a can of worms by introducing these, but you need to know what they mean. So score choice is a testing agency policy, right? College Board and ACT, that says you own your scores. As the person who paid and took the test, you own your scores. Therefore, you can control what you do with them. Most colleges abide by score choice, meaning if you take the test 3 times and one of your tests was better than the others, and that's the only test you want to send in, you can do that. That's your choice because you own the scores. That's score choice. You could send all 3 if you want, but it's your decision. There are a handful of colleges, these 5, and I should probably check because it changes often. Somehow these guys are holding out where they don't abide by score choice. So if you take multiple tests, they want to see all of your sittings. That's score choice. Super scoring is a college admissions policy where basically they're saying if you submit multiple sets of scores, they're going to take your highest section scores and combine those to get a super score, right? So that works in the student's favor. You can also trust that you can trust in it because it works in their favor as well, right? Because they can then publish higher test scores, which is good for their rankings and all that stuff. So super scoring is a real thing. So here's an example of how it works. So we'll say this is Caden, that case study. She took it 3 times. These are her scores, right? So the highest math is a 650. The highest reading and writing is a 640. So that's her super score, is a 1290. And you can see this 1290 is higher than any of her individual scores. So that's super scoring. So score choice and super scoring really are good things from your perspective, from the student perspective. Okay. All right, so just a couple slides on test prep, and then we maybe take some questions. So in terms of preparing, there are many different ways to do this, so I won't get into all the different ways. In general, this falls into that sort of sane and sensible, you don't need to start prepping now. I generally think sort of starting prep somewhere between 8 to 15 weeks leading up to a test date is sensible. And that's kind of necessary. I like to see people lead up to that first official test date because then you're sort of prepped for the subsequent ones. Yeah, so that's just a general recommendation there. And then just what is good test prep? And really these are the three elements. So I've talked about practice tests, hugely important. Content mastery, so you used to always hear like, you know, these tests measure how good a tester you are. And I think that was probably more true, frankly, when we were in high school and the test was more sort of aptitude-based or more kind of tricks. Content mastery is 90 to 95% of how well students do on these tests. So from a preparation standpoint, you want to make sure that your student is solid in all the different areas that are covered. And then strategy, strategy still exists, like how do you pace yourself through the test? How do you work with a multiple choice question? There are different things like that. To me, help you get sort of the maximum out of your current skill set. So these are really the 3 legs of the testing stool. Oh, wrong way. And then just some guiding principles, most of which I've mentioned. So most students are going to score the same no matter what test they take, but it's worth looking for a student's best test, whether that shows up in a score difference or a personal preference. If you do end up taking both, and that certainly happens, more than I like to see, but it does happen, prepping for one test helps you prepare for the other. Doesn't get you all the way there, but it gets you a long way there, particularly with this latest change to the SAT. There's now a lot of content overlap. I mentioned this, right? Students score their best at the end of junior year and fall of senior year. It's the rare student who's finished by December of junior year, even high scorers. And then lastly, a good testing plan prioritizes schoolwork over test prep. Testing early and often is generally not sensible. And at the end of the day, it is just a test, right? It's not life or death. It's important, right, from a college admission standpoint. You don't want to put your head in the sand, but it is just a test, and you just do your best on it, and that's it. So I want to wish you guys the best of luck. We have probably time for some questions if people want to ask questions, so thank you.
I just wanted to add
Yeah.
around summer, some of those summer SAT dates. Very few places offer them, those test dates. Cambridge does not. So we can count on that as being an option, and if it really is something you want to do, you really have to register as early as possible. Whitney, you tell me where they are in the summer.
Yeah, so for the July ACT, typically it's only offered at the University of Hereford, and there's a narrow pool of seats. For the August SAT, there's still some more test sites, but as you understand,
accommodations beyond extended time, you're going to have to look at school-based testing. So you need to talk to your school counselor or Mrs. Carroll here about how that process works. That also is not every test date that we offer those. So that's just another thing to throw into things to think about.
So any questions? Yes? Yeah, I know, that's a little bit confusing just to the first time you hear it. So if you take the test multiple times, right, we'll just use the SAT, and if you submit multiple sets of scores to a college, the vast majority of colleges are gonna consider your highest math and your highest verbal from all of you sitting and put those together in matches. The vast majority of them do that, yeah. Yes?
But you would have to submit all scores to be super scored. You can't just send in any super score.
If you
So they
send
see all
in-
the bad scores as well.
Right, so that's like a strategic decision that you would make. So if you took the test 3 times and one of your tests was higher than the other 2 overall, you might just send that one. Or you might, you know, if your highest super score comes from 2 sittings of the 3, you might just send those 2 sittings. Yeah. Yes.
For those schools that don't require ACT or SAT, how do they assess a student academically? I didn't grow up in the States,
Right.
but Canada, we have the same problem. They
Yeah.
have a national examination.
Yeah.
I encountered it once.
So the question is, for those schools that don't require standardized testing, how do they assess students? They're really looking at all the other factors. Yeah, they're looking at your grades, your curriculum, your college essays, your recommendations.
Depending on what high school you go to, it can be vastly different academically.
Right, so that's, right,
Talking
so,
about grade inflation. and
right,
absolute
so they know New Canaan for sure. And there, you know, I could talk to you after, there's a very cynical view of test optional, and sort of why colleges do it. I think that's true for some, but then there's also very legitimate, sort of mission-driven reasons that schools go test optional. So it's kind of a whole can of worms, but to answer your question directly, they're looking at all the other factors. Yeah. Yes.
When you take SATs, what's the turnaround in terms of getting the results? And does that affect, so I was thinking of it affecting if you were to take it 2 months later or something?
Yeah, so you get them in like 2.5 weeks, roughly
Oh.
speaking. Yeah, pretty quickly.
Thank you, Becky. I was gonna say, I know we ran out of packet, so if you didn't get one and you want some of that on the way out, you want to check out with us and get your contact information, make sure we get that to you. So,
And I also don't always ask them to give me a box of them too. So we will have them in the College and Career Center, hopefully next week. I don't know.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you very much, and wish you guys the best of luck.